Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Finca Soledad TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Leuchtfeuer, based out of Wedel, Germany, and this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished third place out of 7 high-end Panamanian and Ecuadorian coffees on that day. And for anybody that's unaware, Manhattan's version of this coffee last year finished as our top coffee of 2022. We previously reviewed Hydrangea's version of this coffee this year as well, and our next review will feature Apollon's Gold's take on it. So it's safe to say that this is a coffee I very much enjoy reviewing, and I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 43. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I definitely preferred this one through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So it's actually really easy to distinguish, as it's not quite as light as the Manhattan version of this coffee, which was a very light version of this one. But it's not quite as developed as the Hydrangea version, which is still a lighter coffee by most standards and metrics, but this one actually falls in line between those two, as not being that uber light coffee, but not necessarily being quite as developed as that Hydrangea one. So it falls in line with that to basically say that this is on the lighter side of coffees, but not necessarily an ultra light coffee. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and that was the blind taste test day. And what gave this coffee away was an ever so slight savory aspect that was also present in the Hydrangea version and a little present from our initial impressions of the Manhattan version of this coffee, with a lot of the sweetness present once it does cool down. It did offer a fair bit of that Mejorado-like sweetness, which I often attribute to being this brown candied sweetness. But outside of that, it did fall a little bit more in line with the unusually listed melon on here. So I'm like, okay, there's a little bit more fruit sweetness than I might have expected or anticipated. This cup is red forward, which is a lot of my previous experiences from this coffee as well. So I can see a lot of the characteristics it shares with some of the other coffees, and that's going to be a theme that plays on this one throughout. Day 18. Through the Chemex, and the savoriness was on the nose of the coffee. However, it didn't necessarily feel as present in the cup itself, as it was offering a little bit more of this tart berry aspect that was somewhat reminiscent of the cranberry-like characteristics we'd experienced from Hydrangea's version of it. It does continue to offer plenty of that sweetness once it does cool down, with a lot of the wild sugary candy sweetness definitely present. The white peach felt very apt, as oftentimes for me, white peaches taste like very sugary fruits in general. Definitely different from a lot of those like yellow peaches, even nectarines. So that in itself did feel a little bit more in line with the notes I list on here. Plenty of the strong sugary sweetness, with more of that unusually listed melon-like component, again continuing to trend a little bit more in those red fruit directions. But these were the first 2 days where we tried with our standard recipe, and really kind of making some adjustments would play a huge role in this one. As a lot of people know, this specific Pepe Hon coffee is a very tricky and finicky one, and that will definitely be demonstrated in this coffee as well. Day 25, opted for the April brewer this time, and this yielded some extremely mixed results, as it offered a fair bit of that SpaghettiOs-like aspect that we had experienced from the Hydrangea version of this coffee. And outside of that, it did seem to improve once it had cooled down, but it's a little hard to get past that kind of very herbal, tomato-like aspect that's present in it. A lot of the classic Mejorado-like candied sweetness. The cup does really skyrocket in a lot of these sweeter aspects once it does cool down, as it just felt like raw sugar, which is another descriptor I had for that Manhattan version of this coffee. It felt like raw sugar at the bottom of a soda can. So this right here, having that listed cotton candy, makes sense. It's this ridiculously just sugary sugar. All right, next up, day 28, opted for the V60 with Leuchtfeuer's recipe, and it's the best it's been to this point. So I found that lowering the temperatures on this one did seem to help, and if you go back and look at some of other reviews of this coffee, that seems to help for whatever weird reason. I oftentimes feel like I lucked into a very successful coffee from Manhattan's version of it, with lower temperatures, as it does offer a slight bit of that savoriness at the start, but it does cool down into a very strong Mejorado-like sugary sweetness yet again. This is a little bit more clean and present, so I'm not necessarily having this cup marred by some of the more savory aspects to it. In addition to that, it does feel a little complex, as it's offering an abundance of sugar in multiple aspects, including a fruit brightness, but still very sweet. Very, very sweet coffee. Day 31 through the Chemex with Leuchtfeuer's recipe, and it's a bit different as the listed watermelon is present and in notable abundance as it's offering a very strong red fruit sweetness. That's one thing I really want to focus on with this coffee is that's the main reason I enjoyed this one so much through this brew method is not only did it really seem to focus on the very strong fruit sweet aspects, but it also seemed to keep a lot of the savoriness more toned down. In addition to that, it felt surprisingly well defined for what this coffee is. Bright and sweet, while there's an ever so slight savory aspect to it, it's not quite as present as the very strong fruit sweetness. In addition to that, a lot of those sugary aspects are still present, mejorado-like brown candied sweetness. So many things to pull out from this one on this day 31 mark. We continue on to day 34. And it's been a very stark contrast with the experiences from the brew methods, as through the V60, it is again reminiscent of Hydrangea's version, which at times felt a little bit overly savory. Again, ever so slightly tomato-like with plenty of the herbal florality. So I'm thinking again, more of those hibiscus-like characteristics while at the same time offering a lot of these sugary aspects once the coffee does cool. So interesting, but that's not necessarily what I was looking for in this coffee. I was looking for a lot more of Manhattan's version of it. And then on day 37, we had the best results we had up to this point, which was kind of a combination of lower temperatures and a slightly lower concentration, as it continues to offer very little savoriness relative to some of the previous experiences, while offering plenty of that white peach sweetness and something I would describe as a very raw, clear sugar, just like sugar. And I don't really have a good description. That's why I said sugary sugar earlier, because it just is such a strong sugar that tastes like, for lack of a better word, sugar. The cup is ultra sweet with plenty of the red melon characteristics and the mejorado-like brown candied sweetness, which continues to come off as very sugary. Day 40, final notes we have, and I kind of ran out of space for notes on this one, so basically echoed a lot of the similar sentiments we'd had before. Just a very sweet sugary cup, tastes of very strong sugar, not too much to add to that. So let's go ahead and transition then right into the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, and I don't think that will come as a surprise to anybody. It is the sweetness, level 5. Yes, these coffees are ridiculously sweet, and this coffee right here continues to offer that as well. This was a ridiculously sweet coffee, especially with so many of those sweet, sugary, as well as brown candied characteristics to this one. Fruit characteristics also very sweet. Sweetness from so many different angles, and as a result, it definitely justified that level 5 mark. Is it just as sweet as these coffee like Morona Zamora or last year's Manhattan's version of this coffee? I could say it's pretty close. It's on par with a lot of those coffees. This one right here would probably score that level 6 for sweetness. Hyper sweet coffee. All right, then we have a handful of level 4s, more than expected. So let's go ahead and start with the cleanliness level 4. Yes, this was a pretty clean cup of coffee. There were moments where I said, okay, this has actually really nice definition to it relative to some of the other experiences we've had from Pepe Hijon's coffees. So that's really nice and a point in this coffee's favor, as it definitely justifies that level 4 mark. Would be really surprised if it pushed any higher than that, given that this coffee in general isn't necessarily the most defined at times. It continues to offer one very strong note and then some kind of a subtle complementary aspects. Finish, level 4. Yes, even with the very strong sugary candied sweetness that's present within this one, it does finish a little bit more even. So it's not overbearing in any sense. It doesn't continue to linger for an extended period of time. So level 3 works really well for me on that one. Florality, level 4. Yes, and what's very interesting to me is that they do have a magnolia note list on here, and I'm not going to lie, I don't necessarily have a good idea of what that tastes like. I assume it's in line with a lot of white flower experiences. For me, this one was a lot more in line with that hibiscus-like aspect, as it was a little bit more herbal in that red sense. So typically when I get that from a coffee, I like to focus it on that hibiscus specifically. So I can see plenty of florality, very much in line with what they have listed on here, but maybe just a different floral component for me. Grapefruit, level 4. Yes, this is probably the biggest wild card of this coffee, because it's not something I experienced from any of the other versions of this coffee that we're going to be discussing. And that was that very strong watermelon-like attribute to it, because it was actually a little pronounced, it was actually a little defined, and I was very surprised to experience it from this one, given that I was shocked in the first place to see it listed on this coffee, and then even more shocked to actually experience it for myself in this one. probably one of the most well-defined watermelon-like characteristics I've experienced to a coffee that isn't an anaerobic processed Colombian coffee, because they skew very heavy in that direction, but without any sort of clarity. So this one right here had it with great clarity, and that's a very unique experience for these coffees. Stone fruit, level 4. Yes, and I do really want to emphasize the fact that this was a lot more in line with that white peach that I do have listed on here, because it's just a sugariness. And I've often said that those white peaches just taste like sugar. So given that this coffee tasted a lot like sugar, and you can kind of see a little bit of a fruity sense to that, level 4 does feel pretty apt for this one. Caramel, level 4. Yes, so it does have a lot of that brown candy Mejorado-like sweetness, and I experienced that a lot throughout this coffee. But what was more pronounced than that was that kind of sugary aspect that I couldn't necessarily find a good place to put in this tasting wheel. So having that there at that level 4 just indicates that yes, it had plenty of that, but if there was one thing that seemed to be even more abundant than that, it was that just very interesting sugary aspect to this coffee. And we have a couple of, we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Yes, and this isn't necessarily the brightest coffee. I feel like maybe some of the adjustments we had made to this one, including their own recipe, does seem to keep this one ever so slightly toned down. So not necessarily a huge abundance of brightness, which works out fine for me, not necessarily a big priority for me. Citrus fruit, level 3. Yes, there's an ever so slight citric aspect to this one as well, which has been a case. It has been something that we've experienced from other versions of this coffee too, so that isn't surprising really either. And then I think the last thing worth discussing is the body at a level 2. So Chemex is probably going to play a significant role in this one, as you could definitely tell a fair bit of difference between the texture of these coffees with different brew methods. So the V60 would definitely seem to accentuate that a little bit more, much more in line with that 3, a little bit more medium bodied. But having this one run through the Chemex, it just did come out a little bit more delicate in general. So not quite to the tea-like extent, but level 2 kind of in that intermediary between those two profiles. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's an interesting looking tasting wheel, but I definitely think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I can definitely say that of these 7 coffees that were featured in that blind taste test, this one is one of my top 3 favorites, and the other 2, of course, being the other Pepe Gijon coffee that we're discussing from Apollon's Gold, and then that Deborah Terroir from Cofea Circular. But if you really ask me to kind of place this one between those 3, maybe it would finish as my 3rd favorite. And if you ask me to place this one alongside of the other coffees we've had from Leuchtfeuer before, I would say that I actually did enjoy that SL34, the Lorita coffee, a little bit more than I enjoyed this one. And I think the big reason for that is this one right here, it didn't necessarily have as many of the similar attributes as the Manhattan version of this coffee. If anything, I could say at times it was a little bit of a cross between that as well as the hydrangea version of this coffee. And a lot of those savory aspects that I did experience with this one were still present, and I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of that part of it. But this is me being really, really nitpicky about this coffee, because at the end of the day, this was still probably one of my favorite coffees that I've reviewed this entire year. It's just one of those things where I've had a fair bit of coffees like this already. Again, I'm going to highlight that Morona Zamora as well as previous iterations of Pepe Gijon's TyOxidator washed processed Típica Mejorado coffee, because they seem to offer that tremendous sweetness. And if this is the first one I would have had, I would have been truly just amazed by how much sweetness was present within this one. That's a great mark for it. This is a wonderful coffee. This is me honestly just being nitpicky, and it is one of the more enjoyable coffees I've had this entire year, so massive props to them on this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you have enjoyed other versions of Pepe Gijon's TyOxidator wash process Típica Mejorado, then I think this is going to be another really nice fit for you, because it does fall in line with those previous themes, of course, being ridiculously strong sweetness, as well as that very strong sugary aspect, that brown candy aspect, and it does offer a little bit more fruits than I'd experienced from the other ones. So maybe in one sense a little bit, I would say, more complex, more of a diverse coffee, but outside of that, it may be not quite as focused and honed in as some of the other versions of this one. I think that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try the coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Finca Soledad TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. Thank you for watching.